Really glad to be here with you all today to talk about a very timely and important subject, and the question of power. Um, I'm Joe. Among other things, I serve as Director of Education at the Albert Einstein Institution, and I've met Rolf through work in climate justice internationally, and he's been a great friend and co-thinker on how we can make climate justice uh, movements more effective. And so I appreciate Rolf for inviting me to come and talk about some of these things. Um, the first thing that I'd like to do, though, is figure out a little bit about yourself and figure out what called you here today. So I think it's really important that before we go into some of these really like high level thinking things, to really remember why we're here and what brought us here into this space. And if you're more of the intellectual type, don't worry, we're going to get to those things. But the first order of business is to really understand why you're here. So I want to give everyone a few minutes. If you feel so moved, please feel free to speak up. If not, please put your answer in the chat. And I just want to know your name and what called you here today. I'm going to open the chat so I can see. We got David Spence from Flagstaff, Arizona.
Yeah, I am David Spence, and I'm here because I need to have the United States own up to the resource extraction that we've done over the last 100 years from the earth and get back in a right relationship. So it's going to take everybody doing that, and I'd like to figure out how.
Thank you, David. Yeah, hopefully we can approach some answers today. It looks like Courtney was getting ready to go. Courtney Miller. If you're speaking, Courtney, we can't hear you. Flagstaff, Sweden. Thank you. Was it, I see Edge turned their mic on. Did you want to go? What called
That
you
was
here today?
earlier.
You just cut out a little bit. You started talking and then it dropped out.
And many of you, by the way, are unmuted or muted. So please look in the lower left-hand corner if you can, and then turn on your microphone. That helps. Courtney, Courtney, Susan, Matilda, Honora, Laura are all muted. And do unmute yourself. Speak up, please.
And then we have Laura B, who is a volunteer and follows Friday for Future, mostly volunteers from the electoral reform angle. And better climate justice policies is one of the main reasons for her volunteer work, for their volunteer work. Sorry, even name your pronouns. Matilda says, I'm part of the international organization calling with the main purpose of motivating and skilling up youth to engage in or take an initiative to climate action as well as local environment group. Here to learn and share knowledge with my work. So that's great. I think we've got a good understanding of what brought people here today. And I think we might be able to approach, some clarity on what it is we're trying to do when we're talking about building power. So I want to start with another question. You can put your answers in the chat or you can speak up. When someone asks you what is power, what do you respond back? What is power? And there are no wrong answers here. The ability to create change, more B. Susan, the ability to effectuate a change. Okay. Roth, the ability to influence to make a long-term change. Very good. Yes, we have a good understanding of power in general, which is a good start. I do need one or two volunteers for this next section. Sorry, when I do engagements like this, they're very interactive. So I should have started with if you thought you were going to just kind of sit back and listen. Um, that's not really how we do things this weekend. We're going to interact a little bit. And so David Spence making decisions for others' lives. Okay, I see that. I see that. Can we have anyone either use the raise hand function for this next piece that we're going to talk about? We're going to go a little bit deeper into power. It really hits to the point of what we're talking about today. I'm going to pick on David because he already spoke up. So, David, if you wouldn't mind turning your mic off, we're just going to have a little conversation. Thank you, David. And can we get one more person maybe?
One person who hasn't spoken
Anyone
up,
else?
who should maybe answer some of these questions would be Chris Peterson,
Mm,
silent
from
one.
New Zealand. From New Zealand, right?
Could be.
All right, so we're gonna do this, and I'm gonna take you through a little scenario, David, and what I want you to do is not overthink it. You know what I mean? It's very simple um, process, and we can get into overthinking, but it really hits to kind of the point of like sort of like how power works. So let's just try this. And people, if you want to talk in the chat as well, that's fine. So I use this situation to really start a conversation about power and its dynamics. And there are really three factors here, right? So I want you to think for a second, David, your friend has a car and you need your friend to pick you up for work. You need to get to work at 9 a.m. in the morning and you need your friend's car to get to work. You call your friend and your friend says they can get you there at 10 o'clock. You don't have a car. What time are you getting to work?
Can I take public transit?
No.
Can I walk?
You're wrong. But if you had to depend on your friend's car, what time are you getting to work?
Well, it sounds like I don't get there till 10 o'clock if he can't help me out any earlier.
hmm So again, we're narrowing the focus, but actually when you do say things like that, it actually helps the presentation, so don't worry about it. Um, Now let's take the situation further, but let's add in two new conditions, right? So your friend has a car. You still need your friend to pick you up from work, right? You need to get to work at 9 o'clock. You need your friend's car to get to work. However, your friend is low on gas and their tank is pretty much empty and you have money for gas. What time are you getting to work?
I can offer to pay for gas if he'll uh, get me to work on time at 9.
Exactly, right? You would be getting to work and you'd be looking nice and cheery like this person in the picture because the dynamics changed in that situation, right? So a lot of times when we look at sort of the resources that people have, the resources that they have like a car, it could be really shiny and great. And you're like, oh, well, this group wouldn't think it's great, but you know, maybe other people would be like, oh yeah, that's great. Um, but that resource only has power insofar as it has a full tank, right? Or it's completely charged, right? Other than that, that resource no longer has power. Now, if you enter into that situation and you say, I have some other resources that can maybe get you to power this vehicle if you can be a little bit more flexible in your schedule, then the power dynamics change, right? And so a lot of times when we think about power, we tend to think about it in this static way, but that's not what it is, right? Power is in fact um, the totality of means, influences, and pressures available to determine and implement policies for society, right? From a political point of view. But oftentimes, similar to, in this previous situation, we are forced to think of power as monolithic, right? And the monolithic view of power assumes power is centered at the top. It assumes power is fixed, solid, and unchanging, and it assumes people are dependent upon the goodwill of the power holder for those things to change, right? But that is not, in fact, how power works. It's not how it's not how it has ever worked. You can even go back to the writings of Machiavelli and understand that, you know, power isn't this stagnant thing, but it's something that is a lot different, right? What it is pluralistic, right? And that the ruler can only rule with the consent and cooperation of the people, and that consent can either be willingly given or coerced, right? And people in power are, in fact, dependent on the sources of power given or coerced from the people, right? So, why are we here then? Well, we're here because there's a really critical question in the way that we think about power and power analysis, right? Because if power is pluralistic, then why are we assessing it as if it's monolithic, right? Why are we assessing it as this sort of like stationary thing that's immovable? And we put these people in power in the center of our analysis versus the whole environment and within which that we're working, right? This is a critical question and a critical theme in the thinking of power and power analysis. All right. And so to start off, what I want to do is look at some of the current power analysis and think about sort of how they've benefited us, how we can honor them, but also think about uh, where we might need to go from there and how we might do that. So I have here a series of, and then Rolf, if there's any questions in the chat, by the way, I just had to pull down my chat screen to see my whole screen and be able to explain these things. So if anyone sees it, please feel free to stop me and ask
No.
questions.
Go on. Nope.
Okay. Um, but these are some of the more typical uh, power maps, right? And I'm sure some folks might even have used them, right? Where we're looking at, a target and then you, and then, family, people, or you look at your opponent, or you look at people who have influence, right? Or you look at this particular decision maker's name, their financial influences, their personal influences, right? And what is clear about all these approaches to mapping power is that at the center of the power map is always the person doing the oppression, right? But if we understand that that is not, in fact, how power works, then why would we continue to only assess power in this way? Now, because I think these things have value, right? But they have value in relation to more dynamic ways of thinking about the power and their relationship. Because what these four power maps represent to me, right? If you look at them side by side, what do you see, right? They assume power is centered at the top or in the middle, right? They assume power is fixed, solid, and unchanging. And it assumes people are dependent upon the goodwill, not necessarily the goodwill in those power maps, but of the power holder and people maybe adjacent to that power holder, right? So what is there to do then? Well, first thing I want to do is I want to honor that these sort of power analysis were actually really good work and got us to a certain point, right? And we need to honor sort of like where they've gotten us, right? What they can do is that they can help you identify your opponent, which is oftentimes is the first step in how we do things, right? What they can also do is let you know, who's on your side or not, right? And that's all critical information. But they also fail to do some critical things, right? And or they focus on things, right? So they focus only on the person who's in power, right? Um, they don't consider the movement's power at all in these things, right? It's maybe the potential or how they could maybe get it, but it doesn't consider it in real time, right? It doesn't allow you to, through that tool, map a path to victory, right? But most importantly, it ignores the dynamic nature of power, which is what we talked about in the very beginning here, all right? So if this is um, where we're at, then I guess the question is, where do we go from here, right? And this is when we really start to break down and understand this process of the power matrix. So if you would allow me here, I'm gonna try to share another screen without leaving this screen. The power matrix. Can everyone see the screen I'm sharing right now? Which screen do you see? Do
The
you see
main
the
one of
slides? Hmm?
the main one of 4 colors.
Okay, let me just make sure I get this right here. Lower my hand. Well, so here I want to introduce the power matrix. And it can go by several names: the situation matrix, the power dynamics matrix, the a lot of different things. Haven't really decided on what it's going to be called yet, but it is a fairly simple way to look at and understand power. If you look on this axis here, what you'll see is your opponent's power, right? It can either be low or it can be high. And on this axis here, you have people power. It can either be low or it can be high, right? But what this matrix allows you to do is to look at power in a relative situation. So let's take, for an example, let's say you have, and again, this is a general example. You have 30 people and your opponent has 10 people, right? And you're gonna go and you are gonna fight them, right? Because you have 30 people and your opponent has 10, right? You would assume that your power would be higher and their power would be lower, right? So you'd have the advantage. And in that situation, you understand how you can maybe take advantage of that advantage, right? But let's say, for example, you still have the 30 people, right? Your opponent still has the 10 people, but your 30 people can't swim and the battle is being fought in water, right? That would flip the script a little bit because in that situation, though in the previous situation where you weren't in water, you were more powerful. In this situation, because it's being fought in water, you're less powerful. So what does this mean for um, power and situations and things like that? Well, what it means is that when we're looking at power and we're doing power analysis, we don't just take into account sort of singular aspects of power, right? We don't just take into account maybe just the numbers or anything like that. We also take into account the situation within which you are doing the fight. And that situation could either give you the advantage or could give you the disadvantage. And knowing this, right, you can choose the right times when it's time to engage and when it's not time to engage. Now, what you'll also see on this power matrix are words like conversion, accommodation, coercion, and disintegration. Now, we're going to do a little side mission here and go over what these are called, and these are called the mechanisms of change, designed by Gene Sharp to really help people um, conceptualize the ways within which they would be able to make change. And what you'll see is in this lower right quadrant, when your opponent is more powerful and you're less powerful, you really only have access to two mechanisms of change: conversion and accommodation, right? But in this upper right quadrant, where you're more powerful and your opponent could still be powerful, you have access to another mechanism of change, which is coercion, right? And then when you move over to this top left quadrant, where you are very powerful and your opponent is less powerful, there's another added mechanism of change, which is disintegration, right? And I want to take a moment to just stop and talk about what those things are and how they might play a role in our movements. So we're going to get back to our piece here and go over each of these things just quickly, just so we understand sort of like what we're talking about and where we're going from here. All right. So let's take a look at conversion. Conversion is simply the change of viewpoints of your opponent in the struggle, right? And so you sort of communicated with them. You said, hey, gas and oil is bad. They're like, oh, okay. So we should change that law. And then they do it, you know? And this is really a lot of things what people think about when they think about strategic nonviolent action, but it's so much more than this. It's not about just converting your opponent or getting them to see your point of view, right? But this is a way to do it, and it has absolutely happened before and is valid. The next level up, if you will, is accommodation, right? This is where your opponent may still have a choice to grant your demands, and though they may not have changed their views, they'll go ahead and do it anyway because they might see you perhaps growing power, right? And so this is often used by the opponents to accommodate people before they start to get too powerful, because they start to realize, well, if we keep rejecting them, then they might even get more powerful. So we might as well just give them what they want now, right? But also another very valid way of achieving a victory. The next and next level of intensity is coercion, right? And this is when, as a result of the struggle, you achieve your win against the will of the opponent, right? So you've outmaneuvered them politically in the streets, in media, or wherever, so well that they are forced to give in to your demands, right? This is not an accommodation. This is, if they don't give in to their demands, they will maybe lose the power that they hold or the position that they hold or something like that. And then the last and most extreme form of mechanism of change is disintegration, right? Think of like the Arab Spring in Egypt, or things like that, when the dictators sort of completely collapse, right? And so it's as a result of the sources of power to that person or group, the previous occupied position of the ruler is completely severed, right? Now, these hold true for people, institutions, corporations, organizations, whatever, right? All these mechanisms of change hold true. And so what does that mean for and sorry, we're going to switch back and forth here. What does that mean for our power matrix, right? Well, it means that depending on where you are, that is the mechanism of change you have access to. So if your power is low, you can only possibly hope to convert and get accommodations. But when your power is higher, you can actually start to coerce people. But then the question becomes, how do we get there? And how do we get to that point? Well, we're going to go over some insights here to talk about how we might be able to do that, right? So, what are some insights that we can glean from this power matrix, right? Well, let's take a look at our situation in the very beginning, and also take a look at some other situations that you may come across in day-to-day life, right? And one of the first insights, and I'm sure there's more to come, but this is just kind of where I'm at right now. Power in one situation may not translate to power in the other, right? So a lot of times we might mistake our power and stop building power because we think because we did something powerful in one situation that we're going to actually be powerful in the next. Let's take this example of a community organization may have the power to influence a local store to include fresh fruits and vegetables in their shipments, or they'll boycott it and won't go. But that same group of people in the exact same situation, right, may not have the power to influence or get a coercive or um, disintegration victory at the state house, for example, right? So, depending on the situation and where you're at, it's good to know in relationship to that, to the people who are in positions of power, where your power is actually at. And a lot of mistakes I see, right, is that, one group may have a significant amount of power in maybe a very local area, or even a group may have a significant amount of power internationally, right, but don't hold that same power hyper locally, right? So it can actually work both ways. And so that's something to think about when we're thinking about, you know, power in particular situations. Another thing to think about is that power ebbs and flows, right? So, Dave, when we were going back and we were talking about the car thing, the power ebbed and flowed. If you didn't have $20, maybe you wouldn't have been more powerful, but you did have $20, right? And so, in that situation, it made you more powerful. If the person had gas, you would be less powerful even with your $20, right? So on and so forth, right? So, power ebbs and flows. And so, we have to pay attention to the ebbs and flows of power. And this is really important for our campaigns and the way that we think about this work. I think especially in certain places like climate justice, right? But let's take a situation local to the United States, the Chicano blowups of 1968, right? And I absolutely love this movie. If you haven't seen it, it's an HBO original film, and it does really goes into great detail on how to effectively organize and use power to your advantage in certain situations. But in this particular situation, we have a large amount of Chicano students who are being horribly abused in their school in LA, right? And so those Chicano students started to organize and kind of step up for themselves, right? And one of the first things that they were able to do is get a meeting and talk to the school board, right? And kind of start negotiating with the school board. But of course, they were negotiating from a position of, I'm not going to say complete powerlessness, but they had not realized their power yet, right? And because of that, they were being completely ignored. Now, what you'll also see in the film, right, is that they discovered this thing as students called average daily attendance week, right? And they realized that because they had already organized so well during average daily attendance week, they were actually quite powerful. And so you see their dot move up to the top right corner of the matrix, right? Now, that's not to say the school is less powerful, right? But they were more powerful, and that reflects in the matrix, right? And then they were able to leverage that situation and were able to coerce their opponents for Latin American studies programs, college programs, like all these different things in their school, because they not only knew they were powerful, but they used that power to weaken their opponent during that ADA week. This is a very short description of the plan. Once, or of what they did, once they grew that power and they did the walkouts or the blowouts, their parents saw them and said, "Why are we letting our kids handle this for them?" You know? And so they took more aggressive action. They escalated even more. They sat in and occupied the school board for I think a month or two, you know. It made, national news and all that stuff, and eventually they were able to win that campaign. But they were able to win that campaign because they understood that power was dynamic. And though 2 weeks ago they may not have been very powerful, or the school board might have been immovable, right? During this week, they were actually quite powerful, right? And the school had an extreme incentive to try to keep them um, in school. And I always love telling this story when I'm working with like younger folks because I always see the teachers kind of squirming in their seats a little bit when the kids are like, "Do we have ADA week?" You know, like, so it gets really interesting, right? So so we've seen in the different ways in which the power matrix kind of makes sense or can make up or have you adjust and think about power. Um, but now the question becomes about the application, right? How do you apply it? And I submit that when you understand your power position, right, you can plan better, right? Why can you plan better, right? Because you can assess the relative power and be able to make better, more immediate decisions, right? So if you find yourself in the lower left quadrant, you know that you may need to do some more base building in this particular situation, or you may need to do more structuring in this particular situation. You can strategize then based off of those power dynamics and then ultimately be able to shift those power dynamics because you understand where you are from the very beginning, right? So let's take a step back and go right into before we are there any questions? Because I've been kind of going through here because I wanted to get to some more questions here. Any questions so far? Thoughts? Should I keep going? Yeah. Does everyone see the power matrix here? Okay, great. So how do we apply it, right? So this is something interesting. You can think about this in phases, but you can also use the power matrix to plan a movement to think about what you should do when, right? So let's take this dot here. All right, let's say you find yourself here on the power matrix. Then you may want to, in your process, and every movement should do this regardless of where they're at, right? But do things like build momentum, raise cost consciousness, or build community, right? The reason why I put all these things is because it overlays with a lot of even different movement systems, depending on what you prefer to use. That's not really the issue. The issue is maybe the analysis of power and how you're applying any of these different movement issues. So you can start to build momentum, raise cost consciousness, and let's look at some of the the methods that you might use. You might start off with teach-ins, right? You might do something simple like the wearing of symbols, right? Or you might do something like a group or mass petition, right? To get going. All very effective ways to start building momentum and getting your power up, right? But then let's say you do all those things well and you start to move up here. Okay, so then what do we need to do, right? So then you move into this space of structuring an organization, right? Um, where you start to get all these people engaged, and now you need to start structuring and organizing it because as that power grows, it can get unwieldy. And in a lot of cases, because people don't go through this step, they might get up here and fall right back down, right? Because there's no structure to what they're trying to do. And so you sort of get this sort of revolving door of movements where they're constantly like back and forth between this space here because they're not taking the time to structure and organize their work. Then, as your power moves up even higher, get back. There we go. This is when you want to start thinking about conflict management, right? And conflict management, though it's not a very popular understanding of doing movement work, it's actually a really critical component of movement work. Understanding when you are in the right position to start to engage in direct conflict with your opponent, right? So, like in all of these stages, you are absolutely in conflict, but here you might want to think about whether or not you are going to be in direct conflict with your opponent. That is, do you have the power to weaken your opponent, right? And so you might not be, but because you become more powerful, you can do things like banners and posters and displayed communications. You can do actions like political mourning, or you can even start to do things like group lobbying, and maybe even start to do things like sit-ins, because it may not be directly at your opponent, right? But it will put you in a position to grow even still more power. Okay. So then once you get up to here, Now we're talking about we are powerful and maybe even powerful enough to reduce our opponent's power, right? So when you get up into this space, now you're talking about a situation where you're starting to reduce your opponent's power. Okay. So you might do something like civil disobedience of legitimate laws, hunting the officials, you might even throw marches in there, walkouts, suspensions of social activities, sick-ins. And as you do that, all of these things, depending on your situation and your strategy, of course, begins to weaken the opponent, right? And moves you into that space where you can more effectively coerce, get exactly what you want, or disintegrate those things like gas and oil, right? Um, and ultimately, you have to be in a very high power situation, right? Be very well organized and connected and have a lot of cost consciousness to do certain methods like a consumer boycott, right? Um, but oftentimes, what we'll see people do is call for a consumer boycott down here, right? But when you look at it in perspective, you see that that probably isn't going to work, right? Because it seems way out of place because you're looking at the whole dynamic of power, right? Um, but one of the things that I also would like to keep in mind is that we don't need to throw away the other power analysis, right? They've actually served us well, and they actually might even have a lot to offer in relationship to the power matrix, right? So instead of throwing it away, I want you to consider how these other power analysis tools might play with the power matrix. For example, I took a group through a process of doing the spectrum of allies, active opponents, neutral, passive opponents, so on and so forth, right? So all the neutral, passive allies, we plotted on the power matrix. We're going to recruit them and we're going to build power through neutral and passive allies, right? So that's a good place to start because you plot them on there. And only until we get up to here will we start attacking active opponents, right? If you take a look at this target here, right? You can again plot this on the situation matrix. Family, funders, peers who are agree with you and are influential, right? You probably want to engage with them here during this process, right? You don't want to skip straight to boss or gym if you haven't done the work here first. Same with this one here, this power mapping tool, the decision maker, so on and so forth, right? Family influences, so on and so forth. Who has the power to decide, so on and so forth. We know that's not a relevant or even an accurate question, but just bear with me. And you have all these things here. Again, you plot it here, right? Who are these people? You can even take something like Robert Helvey's pillars of support. If you understand this, you understand that if you remove the pillars of support from your opponent, then your opponent can no longer operate, right? But one of the things that Robert Helvey does do that other power analysis don't do is they also have you analyze the power of the movement and where your power is at. And what you might find in any general situation is that you may not have any power right now, right? So what do? You could also take these and you can start to plot them on the power matrix. We'll be more powerful if we can recruit youth. We will be more powerful if we recruit and organize NGOs, so on and so forth, right? And once we get powerful, we might even be able to recruit real that's the opponent. But let me see. Okay. Once we get more powerful, we might have access to media, things like that, right? Once we get more powerful, we might be able to blunt the force of maybe religious organizations. Of course, any of these can be on either side, right? But the point is that it's not just this stagnant understanding of power, right? It can also give you a roadmap of how you're going to most effectively build power. And it doesn't mean that just because you use this, that you can't use any of these other systems of mapping power, right? Or thinking about power. What it means is that it will help you also plan your campaign and move things forward. Um, so where were we at here? And I think that is it. Right on time, Rolf.
You mean it
Any
already went
questions?
pretty?
What?
And boy, I was so into this that I didn't even realize it went so quickly. I actually, I was thinking about disintegration. You actually, in the US today, have a counter disintegration. There's an attempt to um, attack us, including the climate change movement. And let's say one has to play defense in the process of being offensive. And do you have any thoughts about that?
Do, and I think that is also a big question of strategy. And this goes into other ways of executing strategic nonviolent action. So much of the way that we think about it is about what we can. Well, that's not true. But like in a lot of ways, people's immediate thing is like, what can we tear down, right? But there's also a process of like, what are we trying to build, you know? And that has to be um, an integral part of the strategy, and in fact lends itself to the lower right portion of the quadrant, right? Because when you can talk to people clearly about what it is you're trying to build and engage them in that process of like we're trying to build a world where everyone is free and things like that. Like it could be more engaging for people. It could be a lower bar for entry for people. Um, but also, more to your point, though, with the disintegration of the United States right now, as we are seeing it, um, that does call for a position where you're trying to get to a point where you can have massive non-cooperation with these structures that are going in place, right? But you still have to take the same route. There are no shortcuts. Um, and we have to think just right now, diversity, equity, inclusion was outlawed in Ohio just like yesterday, all right? What is the conversation that we have with people, college campuses, organizations, things like that, about non-cooperation, right? But have we been working with building and structuring together so that we can sustain the repression that comes with it, right? Because what's clear is that, based off what I've seen, that though I can't speak directly to what to what the administration is doing, or but I also can say that it seems as if they have no problem repressing people, right? Especially with the pen at first, and who knows how far it will go after that. And so that's why I think it's important to even while we are thinking about the certain things that are being disintegrated, we have to think about also what is the cost benefit of engaging while you're in the lower right portion of the matrix, right? Like, will you risk teaching people that just this doesn't work, you know, when you haven't sort of gone through that process of like building to the point to where you can actually give it a good shot. Um, and so that's something really that we need to think about because what we're seeing is a lot of sort of reactivity, but that reactivity outside of sort of like passive decisions that people are making, that's making, like, say for example, Tesla lose money, or Target, or things like that, are all good, and that's a good thing to do. Well, but I think was just talking with a colleague about this yesterday, is that we sort of have to take some responsibility for people's understanding on how we need to build to this thing. Because if we have a huge outburst and that huge outburst is sort of routed and scattered, right? What we'll be teaching the people on the sidelines is that no matter how many people we get into the streets, it doesn't really matter, right? But that's not the case. It's about the power difference, the power dynamics, how we effectively use it to squeeze a victory out of, certain situations. I hope that answers your question, Raul.
Yeah. It's a lot of food for thought in all this. I actually, I don't want to ask too many questions, but there is the spontaneous boycotts going on all over the world, as you mentioned with Tesla, which is interestingly showing the power of consumers.
Yeah.
And it's, I think, underassessed, especially if you went after Amazon or even some of the people that are in the social media dominance, like Zuckerberg. And it's a way also of organizing. Boycotts can, so even if you're in the lower quadrant, it can help people to move forward because they feel empowered actually by their success against, let's say, Tesla, for instance. I'm just throwing that out for, but let's hear what everyone else has to say. So, yeah.
My position on that, because I think that's actually very interesting, like a really good thought about it, right? Though the boycott may not bring down the group, it could be a very good recruitment tool to see who's on your side and who's not, right? And then you bring
Yeah.
those people in and empower them. That's actually not thought about it that way. And so yeah.
Yeah.
I see that. I definitely see that. And that's the whole point. This whole thing is dynamic and it gets you thinking, right? Like about how we can use all these different things in different situations. So thank you for that. Sorry. I thought someone else had a question or was going to speak up. I will send Rolf a link to these slides and you can take a look at it.
Yeah, and also I might mention that the recordings are available for everyone. And I will I'll type in a link to the chat box.
Yeah, I can actually put the link in there now. If you
Yeah,
need me to.
okay. Well, I was thinking the link to the overall talks, so.
Oh, yeah, I'll send you the links. Any other thoughts or criticisms?
And I urge the silent ones to speak up. For instance, Laura or Courtney, what are your thoughts? Susan Heinley from New York. Any reaction to what's been brought up? I can give a personal reaction to this. The first time I heard it, I had it difficult to absorb until I started mapping out where different groups were and where the climate change movement was. And I came to the conclusion that we're in the lower the lower right corner. And then it's a question, how are we going to get out of that quandary? And it's a long struggle. And I think the ideas that you have there of conversion and accommodation are right on. So.
I, for another,
Yes.
need some
Oh, go ahead,
time
please.
to process. Yes. Thank you. Very
Mhm.
interesting. And lots to think about. I'm going to need some time to see how it can apply to organizing in my very conservative county. But thank you. Yes, something to work on.
And if there's very much silence, I'm going to ask Joe another question. You understand, I'm sure, the concept of reactance. Essentially turning off people by actions that don't help to move the movement forward. And what are your thoughts about how to avoid reactance in a time when there's an offensive attitude that, well, we should throw all foreigners out of the country, that are such as in the last couple of days, some people being arrested for just having written an article against supporting the people in Palestine. So how do we deal with the reactance effect? Because if we do something wrong, it will disadvantage our own efforts.
I think there's a couple things to think about, and again, though these things are good to think about and do while you're in the lower um, right quadrant, and honestly, I would think of the lower right quadrant as an opportunity, right? As an opportunity to sort of set the stage for an effective upper right quadrant rather than a deficit, right? It just lets you know what work is most urgent right now. Um, and when you're in that space, we really have to think about in what ways are we going to hold the people who are doing the work and might experience some of that repression, um, how we're going to hold space for them. I think it's very any similar, and that I think that's what you're talking about. People who are getting punished more or less for the things that they're doing, right? And I think what we need to do is create spaces. Um, it may be physically or technically, if you will, right? Like they're very well-being, or it might be more spiritual or emotional, right? Like how they're doing on the inside. All those things we need to hold space for when those things happen. And I think that is a critical part of building the organization, right? That we create space to hold people during repression. Because what we'll see it, what I imagine what we see in movements that sort of hold people in repression. I think, when I've experienced repression, we sort of start to come together and band together, and we use it to push our pieces forward. And a lot of times, um, there are movements that will sort of use the people as kind of like cannon fodder, right? And so when they do have that repression happen, those people are kind of like left to their own devices, right? Which also means you should think about how well you are organized to be able to effectively handle repression, right? If you're going to do an action that involves 2,000 people, you should probably organize the requisite amount of legal help, funds, things like that to help the people who might get into an issue. Of course, it's not always going to be perfect, and it may not always be able to do that. You may have your back up against a wall, but I think it's definitely something to think about. That when these people uh, do these things and these things happen to them, it's sort of first on the list to sort of to run to their aid, because that's going to give everyone else courage, because they're going to know they're going to be taken care of, you know. Yeah, I hope that answers your question. It was sort of like where we're going with that. Yeah.
More questions from Chris or Edge? You have to unmute Edge if you can.
Um, Yeah, I'm interested in being able to like read those slides in your PowerPoint at a later time. If you put them somewhere, I'm too new to Zoom to have found them yet.
Sure, Ralph will send them out and we can, yeah, talk about it then.
So you'll be getting two things, essentially, everyone here. One is you'll get a link to where the presentation has been made, and then you'll have a link to the PowerPoint itself. So any other comments or questions for Joe? Just remember, he's on here for you, and he has a fountain of experience, massive. And so please ask. Don't be afraid. Susan Heinley, another quiet person. Would you like to ask a question? I'm putting everyone on the spot, and I apologize for that aggressive behavior, but asking doesn't hurt.
I actually
Okay.
think something, oh, go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, you first, Joe.
Oh, something Courtney Miller had talked about with her conservative area. I think that's something to think about. With the power matrix, it allows you to think through um what particular ways you need to build power given your political environment, you know, what things you might want to prioritize in that political environment. There's a very interesting study that came out years ago, and there hasn't really been more, I don't think, that's happened on it. But it was called Leadership, Membership, and Voice, and it was published by uh, Marshall Gans. And basically, what they talked about was they controlled for three things in a movement space: um, money, political environment, and leadership capabilities of the people in the group. And they did these with Sierra clubs actually across the United States. And what they found was that when they controlled for money or, resources, political environment, and leadership, they leadership almost always won. You're right. Pound for pound, that was the most important thing outside of the money you had in the political environment. So as you think about sort of like how you might build power in that particular situation, especially in an unfavorable political environment, you might want to think about how you develop the leadership, right? And so it may not be getting a bunch of people because it's mostly conservative, but it may be about getting the right people and developing those people to make really smart political maneuvers in that particular situation. Had a situation like that here. I live in a bit of a conservative area too, but we were able to stop, the school board from doing things that might hurt children during the pandemic, using very clear to the point approach of how we were going to do things. So, um, I wouldn't give up on your situation because it's very conservative. I would say you just need to think about your power in the context of that conservative area. And I think Susan raised her hand, so she might have something to ask
Yes.
or say.
Yes. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I'm sorry. I'm not in a space where I can have be involved as much as I usually am, but I just want to thank you because it's fascinating and I really appreciate your reminding us that power is dynamic, that it's always changing. It's not fixed. It's really a basic insight, but I think we tend to forget it. So that is really important. Like so many others on the call, I have to think about this. It's a lot to process. And I look forward to kind of studying the slides. The only thing that occurred to me that would, I mean, since it's already this complex matrix, it would be super cool if you could somehow work in the various costs involved in these various choices you make about how to, effectuate power. I mean, some things are going to take more from you, take more resources, more time, et cetera, than others. And, you find often I have in my history of political organizing, chosen a route that ended up completely depleting, our energy, our resource, we achieved it, but we didn't shift the power and we were, sort of burned out. So, and that's so important. So, since you've already got this fascinating, complex matrix, it'd be cool to have some kind of a scale or some way for organizers to always stop and think, now, what's that gonna cost us, to choose that route? That's the only comment I would make. But thank you so much for your work. It's very fascinating.
Could I jump in with a comment here on conservative areas? In part, we're involved in NASCA and a fairly conservative area of Prescott, Arizona, which probably has one of the highest voting rates for Donald Trump in all of Arizona. And something that Catherine Hayhoe, evangelist, activist on climate change, has repeatedly said, and this relates actually to your matrix conversion. Converting people, really, the basic, most important thing is talking to them. And it doesn't matter what political orientation they have, as long as you can communicate in a way that you share common values. And irrespective of what people believe, we share common values with many, many people that don't agree with us on climate change, for instance. And this can be on love of children, love of family, love of freedom, love of economic security. They're all basic things that we share in common, even though they think, well, we're threatening them if we get too open in our positions. But there is a commonality there that leads to what is most successful. That's building relationships. And the conversion process that Joe mentioned in the lower quadrant there is really most essential. And I've seen places where people are a little frustrated because they say, oh, people don't understand. But really, we've isolated ourselves in some ways by we failed to approach the conversion process by the nature of the language that we're using, for instance, on climate change. I think it has to be more mundane in it's pocketbook issues, it's life issues, it's health issues. It doesn't have to just be that the sky is falling and we're all going to die soon of emission poisoning. So the conversion concept there is real essential, especially when we are in that lower quadrant and we want to move out of it. Thank you.
I think you're absolutely spot on, Rolf. Like that is a big piece missing from the climate justice movement as a whole. Being able to have those conversations and doing conversion work and continuing. So if you notice in the matrix, you can always do in any of the four quadrants, you can always do conversion work, like it's always something that should be on the table. But in relationship to what you were saying and also what Susan was saying, you also think about the cost of some of the things that you do, right? Maybe in a particular situation, the action that's chosen isn't going to, right? Like in theory, you would want it to reduce the power of your opponent and convert onlookers to your side, um, and not be too much of and not be too much of the of a burden on your structures. right? Like, so in that way, you want to think about like all of these different things, how one action could both help to convert, start conversations, do things like that, and but also weaken your opponent's sources of power and their pillars of support as you go through that process. So that's a thing to think about as well, because one of the costs is what, like Susan, could be that maybe movements that are adjacent to yours and might have maybe wanted to join would sort of like step back and be like, "Ah, I don't know if I want to do that, you know? But there are ways to find powerful ways to cut off power to an opponent, especially on the climate justice scene, and convert onlookers and third party people and build your momentum and power as you go through it and you do it, you know? You just have to put maybe some more thought into it.
So more questions, anyone? I think we're going to call it, Joe. And Jeff Sherwood put his thumbs up, and I definitely agree with that. Your presentation is very good and appreciate it, and your participation here. And as said, I will try to circulate some of these things to all the people who signed up. There were something like, I think 90 people who signed up for this. And obviously they're not all here, but do consider looking at the recording. So, and thank you so much, Joe. And thank you all for participating here. And we will have, we have more people scheduled for the fall and for the summer. It'll be a little slower, I think, in the summer, but we're running these about once every month. And we're inviting speakers. And again, if you have speakers, especially with knowledge and experience at the grassroots, because I think one of the keys for all our work that we're doing in climate change is at the grassroots. It's more basic than anything else for our success. So thank you for coming on. And thank you, Joe, again.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Yeah.